the healing intelligence is something that's always within us and is always accessible. And psychedelics are just very powerful tools that help us to remember that or reconnect with that intelligence and be a lot less in our head. Because I think that's the main problem for a lot of people on their healing path, is that what is actually in the way is kind of that we are a lot here in our heads. And it's actually about learning to bring our awareness back to our body and, reconnecting with our heart. It's not only about experiencing that in a psychedelic experience, but then actually really integrating and becoming that and starting to live our lives from that way in the day-to-day.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations. Today with me I have a returning guest and a very popular guest, Sanne. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey Susan, yeah, it's great to be back. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Your shorts have been the most popular, I have to say. It's been really, really impactful, especially the one which we'll get into after. But for our listeners, just want to give a quick context around who you are so they can connect with you. So Sanne Ham is a trauma-informed holistic therapist, an artist, and an entheogenic guide. So Sanne and I go back a long way back. So we met probably around 5 years now. I can't remember, but very long time ago.
Maybe even more, yeah.
Probably longer than that. So we met quite a while ago, and both of us kind of like went into this holistic therapy space more intensely, I think more focused and more intentionally. And I always love having you back, Sanne, just because you're one of those people that I can have the real, true, authentic conversations, and that you contain, and you're one of those people that I see in the psychedelic space, especially psychedelic medicine space, as someone who's really coming in with a lot of integrity, intentionally, and also leading the way with more authenticity than, sometimes it's hard to see. So for that, I want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing, because especially for me, you're an example. You're leading by example among the young people, because you are really a younger, generation of working with medicines and in that creative space. And because, some of us that are a little bit older, as you can imagine, and you're probably witnessing it already, there is a lot of baggage. There is a lot of healing to be done. There is most of us, like from my generation, a bit older, we seem to come into it with like ready to lay down the templates, the old conditioning and old operating patterns and systems and, coping mechanisms. Like there is a lot that we want to lay down and move away from and move forward with our lives. But for you and your generation and younger people, they also want to bring the creativity. Because they are still in the beginning of their lives, and they still want to thrive and create, be creative and travel and experience life. Still, they're very much in the beginning. So I think you're a gift in that sense, because you understand this and you're always in that creative space. I follow you, I follow your posts, and there's all this consistency in leading the way authentically. So I want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I believe one of the most important values to have, I think, on this path is authenticity, right? But because what is very powerful about So when we're getting into like the work with medicine and with psychedelics, what is most powerful, I believe, is that it brings us back in touch with our truth, and not truth in the sense of, okay, like factual truth, but it actually brings us in touch with our authentic truth, but also even kind of beyond that, right? Yeah, so I love also kind of writing about that process and kind of turning it into art. So there are many different ways. That's what I always like to share.
Yeah. Also, just to give a little bit more introduction to our listeners, just to say, by the way, your third time guest now. So we will link the first and the second conversation we had. For our listeners, if they enjoy this conversation, they can check out the other ones that we had together. So just briefly, what brought you to this work?
Yeah, so actually, my path or the work that I do wasn't planned at all. So I didn't really know it ahead of time. So like you already mentioned, I began this path quite young. So I already started facilitating psychedelic sessions probably around 5 or 4 years ago, so in my early 20s. And before working with psychedelics and medicine, I already did a lot more deeper inner work. So I think initially more the holistic healing path started really with me for like first eating healthy foods, movement. I got really into CrossFit and very deep into inner child work. And it's also kind of how I started working more as a trauma-informed therapist, really diving deep into childhood trauma. And I kind of became the awareness of the impact of trauma came more through my own personal experiences. So when I shared it in previous episodes. So when I was 18 years old, I had a near-death experience and a heart attack. So it kind of was really a very strong wake-up call, and I had what you would call like a mystical experience or out-of-body experience. And that completely changed my perspective on reality and on life, on death, on healing. So it really opened me up to asking different questions in life and then finding like natural ways to heal. So I was very fortunate to then heal from that heart attack within 1 year. And then it was always, and I think that's kind of how I can best describe my path, is like one thing led to the next. So kind of after kind of going more into holistic health, you can say, I then went more into trauma-informed therapy because I then discovered I was still struggling from anxiety and post-traumatic stress, and it kind of through those experiences, it's almost like everything in my life that it hadn't fully processed and experienced, and kind of everything we kind of stuff away, and it all started to surface again. So then I was called to work with like trauma-informed modalities that help us to integrate these traumas. And then after I completed the training in that, then I was asked to go to a psilocybin retreat. So it was already years later. And then I said yes. And that's where I also met Alice and Carrie, who founded A Whole New High. And after having my first experiences with psilocybin, it was very powerful for me. And it was really incredible experience. And I got really fascinated with it. And then later also Alice and Carrie wanted to train me also in psilocybin therapy because they were kind of looking for someone to join their team, and I did. So it wasn't planned at all. I was asked for it, and I kind of went along with the opportunity, and I fell really in love with the work. I'm also someone who really loves to travel. So I've traveled a lot over the years and also learned from different men and women who work with medicine. So it's kind of, I really love to explore. So for me, just I go and explore, and then things and opportunities come out of it. And that's kind of leads me in very short story kind of to where I am today. There's a lot to it.
Yes, of course. There's always, isn't there? That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And now, being in the space for a while, I think it'll be an amazing sort of, if we open a thread to just overview, what are you seeing in the latest psychedelic renaissance, so it's called, as you know. So we are experiencing the psychedelic renaissance, which just means that the return of the psychedelic medicines, the plant medicines, into the mainstream again, and which is very powerful because we have this research, the medical model, there is the clinical model, there is the corporate, there is the Western, there is the indigenous. There's so many things are coming all at once. And in this noise, like, what are your observations? Like, I think it would be lovely to review what's going on in this current climate of these medicines.
I've seen a massive shift. I think if we would see like kind of the process of about 5 years, if we would kind of look back at it, what I love about the change and the shift, it's so much more well known. So in the beginning, people were not part of that scene at all. With psychedelics, they would have no clue what you were talking about if you would mention psychedelics and healing. And now, and I think especially Michael Pollan's work has played, I think, a huge role, and also, of course, the John Hopkins studies, and then later also in London. So what I've seen is that it's really entering now the mainstream. And I think on one hand, it's a beautiful thing because it becomes more accessible to people and more people know about it who otherwise, who don't read scientific researches or are more in like the spiritual communities. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I would also say that it also brings with it its challenges, like everything. I think everything has a light side and has more a shadow side to it. What it's difficult for me to really do like one big bird's eye view because I mainly work more in the retreat space. So that's kind of where I can speak most of my own experience. And what I've seen is that it's almost like in the beginning, the people that came to us, they had this fascination more, I think, with psychedelics or the way the mind works, or they were like fascinated with neurology. And often people also, of course, also had like mental issues or emotional issues or addictions or things that they wanted to work through and heal. But there was almost, it felt more like it was this deep calling to the medicine. And I think now, because it's more in like Netflix series and a lot of books and a lot of interviews and a lot of information out there, where it's like the solution, and it's kind of presented as that. And I don't think that's because it's not done in a good way. I think the producers and the people who write really have well intentions. I think that, and that's often what I also explain to clients that come to me, is that when we're watching a documentary of like an hour and a half, what we're seeing highlights of people's psychedelic experiences. And also that the people that are being picked for those interviews, of course, have the most fascinating experiences. So it's not like the people who create these documentaries, they do kind of portray a real image of what is really possible with these medicines. And also it can give still a kind of a view on psychedelic that doesn't completely translate to reality in the sense of the diversity of the experience. So that's, I think, something I would hope to see more. And that's what I'm trying to do, see like how diverse these experiences can be. So that can be that, for example, like you mentioned before, like people are older and a very strong coping mechanisms, and they've been disconnected from feeling and like being in control for a very long time. And they do that for reasons, right? In order to stay safe. And we live in a very stressful world with a lot of pressure. But then maybe the first experience, you're not allowed to go as deep as you saw in the documentary. And to know that that's something that's very common as well. So what I would like to see more of is definitely to give a little bit more of a diverse perspective, instead of only showing like the highlights. And I think that's kind of a problem with media now in general, right? We're seeing the peaks, but not as much more the depth or more the nuance that is to it. And I would also say that I'm someone who always really focuses a lot on my own thing and my own process. So I am kind of less someone who's like focused on everything and knows the newest things that's kind of going on in the psychedelic field. I really like to focus on more the process, like I mentioned before, more the embodiment of the insights I receive and my experiences, or the people that I know and who are also doing this work, to kind of have open conversations about.
And
this is a
this is a beautiful observation. It's a beautiful observation. These are the conversations we need to be having right now. I love that you said the Netflix. Let's, for example, take Netflix documentary series from Michael Pollan. As you said, it's a beautiful documentary to bring it to people. But what we need to do as people in the space is to now bring the education to tell people that, okay, this is great, but don't focus on the highlights of those experiences that you're seeing. And also, again, which is a really big one, you said those people are handpicked. They are also trying to make a thrilling documentary series, right? So there has to be some kind of like, it gives into the hype somehow.
It's still entertainment, you know, and even if it's like conscious entertainment. So I think it's a lot better of all the things that are out there. And I really love Michael Pollan's work, you know. It has nothing to do with him and his work, but it's kind of just how the entertainment industry, even like conscious entertainment, it's kind of how it works. So and when we look at that and we know that, so we have the awareness, okay, I'm looking at highlights and I'm looking at peaks, then we can still enjoy it and we can still learn a lot from it. But it will, like I said, it won't then create false expectations. And I think that's the shadow side. What I sometimes see is that because of all those highlights, it can create false expectations. And then when those expectations are not being met, most of the time people actually internalize that and make it something about them. Okay, because a lot of people that come to psychedelic therapy often have tried a lot of different therapies, or there can be this core wounding of there's something wrong with me, or this is not going to work for me. So when then the experience doesn't unfold as they expect, then sometimes those expectations can kind of get in the way. Instead of seeing that every experience is unique, every human being is unique where we are. Some of us are very open and sensitive. So that's what you see a little bit more with the younger generation, especially people who are already more creative and sensitive. And it can be that for the older generation, or people that, you know, that have very difficulty accessing their feelings and emotions, that, okay, maybe the first experience is not going to be that peak experience, but still it can be incredibly valuable. And I think the most important thing I like sharing is that we need to kind of let go of the idea that something externally is going to fix you. So we can do this in relationships. We can, and we're also kind of now doing it with psychedelic medicine. So we're kind of expecting something, I'm going to put this in my body, and then it's going to kind of do the healing for me. And like a part of it is true. Like when we're having a medicine experience, we're receiving healing, right? Because medicine is what brings about healing and wholeness. So these are very powerful tools that can help us to undergo a healing process and kind of return to or remember our inherent wholeness in many different ways. Only what it's doing, what it's activating, is something that is inherently already within you. So I think that's the gift that I have from not beginning my healing journey with psychedelics, is that, and also through my near-death experience and things like that, is I already discovered that the healing intelligence is something that's always within us and is always accessible. And psychedelics are just very powerful tools that help us to remember that or reconnect with that intelligence and be a lot less in our head. Because I think that's the main problem for a lot of people on their healing path, is that what is actually is in the way is kind of that we are a lot here in our heads. And it's actually about learning to bring our awareness back to our bodies and, reconnecting with our heart. And it's not only about experiencing that in a psychedelic experience, but then actually really integrating and becoming that and starting to live our lives from that way in the day-to-day. And sometimes there's not really that, I don't really see that translation, because it's still coming from a little bit like the pharmaceutical models, like, okay, you have this problem, so you're going to take this, and that will then probably solve it. But that's just reality, I think, is a bit more complex than that. And it's also, I think, way more beautiful, because it means that not even everyone has to take psychedelics. I think it's also really kind of looking a little bit further and expanding our mind beyond that. And that's actually what I've learned a lot through traveling and learning from different indigenous cultures or people who don't work with psychedelics but other healing modalities. And I'm really grateful to have learned that, because when we look at that, it's not like people just take psychedelics or medicine. It's always the way you start living your life. And I prefer working with natural medicine, so come from the earth. So a wonderful way already is, and that's what really helped me to integrate that into my life, is really spending more time in nature, really slowing down, focusing a lot more on the creative process, because psychedelics can open that too. So knowing that and then we can access those states even without needing something externally. And of course, it's a process, and there's nothing wrong with needing something at certain parts of our process, but not making that everything or projecting so much onto it, because often our projections kind of can get in the way.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the relationship to the Western model needs to, like, we can't bring that Western model into the psychedelic medicine space, because there is a process, and there is a relational process. Like, we need to allow ourselves to build that relationship with the medicine, the choice of the medicine that, the individual is working with. And the Western model of like having that, pharmaceutical approach of, you have a problem, you take something. I think we need to have a lot of, work done on that area to change our relationship with the medicines, of course, the plant medicines. So, and also like understanding the connection to our own healing intelligence, internal. This is where we have the most, challenge, because somehow, again, the environment is not supporting that belief. So the environment is actually driving us further away from that belief. Therefore, the consumerism, the way that we outsource everything we need is still very dominant in the psychedelic space that I see. Like outsourcing whatever we need instead of the realization or the acceptance of like, we can get to a place with our own efforts and our own commitment, our devotion, our connection, or cultivating that connection. Somehow this is now becoming the most challenging and unknown process for us living in the Western model, right? And what I loved earlier, you said something about entertainment versus, embodiment, like understanding how they affect us. For me, it's always been that medicines show us where to start the work. It's not that we take them and they do the work, but it's actually, they kind of help us to open that window of seeing and then realizing where the work needs to begin. Often than not, my biggest, challenge, or that I'm trying to bring more to the conversation, which is very challenging, is that the medicines help us to be better navigators in the mundane life. Like, it's not the other way around. Somehow, because it involves mystical experiences, transpersonal, and it involves non-ordinary states and conscious evolution of our consciousness, right? Somehow we have abandoned, or somehow, not everyone, this is not just generally speaking for the sake of this conversation, I meet so many people that they just not want to be here anymore. Like, they can't be here in this world because, look, we're living in this post-pandemic era. Things are not easy, economical, relationship-wise, as a parent, as a sibling, as someone's kid. It's not easy. Like, we've been challenged and kind of pressured in all kinds of various ways. And, my intention always is, okay, can we, use the medicines to actually become better at what is challenging us here. We don't need to go to 5D. We don't have to transcend this body, or that we are the human, and we the spiritual aspect of it as well. It's almost like validating that disconnection that's already been there. Could be a trauma response. Like, another big challenge that I try to bring more conversation to is that dissociation for years and years of like practiced ingrained dissociation. It can be the validating thing in the psychedelic space, where people are, instead of coming back into their lives and owning parts of their lives and improving, it's like it just validates more of the transcending it or escaping from it, or we can use all these words, but I think you understand what I mean. It's like almost validating that thing in the first place, that you didn't want to be here, you didn't want to feel it, you didn't want to face it. The confrontation is like a big no-go area, and we just want to drink more medicine and escape, rather than be in the body and face challenges head on. So these are like my current observations in the medicine space. And of course, having these conversations might open up spaces for people to hear something or acknowledge or resonate, at least. But one of the latest content that I've been listening around trauma, which really resonated with me as well, coming from that kind of background, is people, coming back to dissociation, somehow the medicines can take us to our early stages or earlier states of dissociation, when we go through these, freeze, in the face of trauma or perceived hostile environment, or perceived, unsafe or unpredictable environment that children end up growing up in. So the only way to numb things down, calm things down, and control is like to freeze, to dissociate. So as soon as people come into the medicine space with that kind of response, same thing. It's like almost bringing more conversations around these kind of things that manifest, that not necessarily is a good thing. It's actually indication that we could look and break it down and start to work with these things. So I'm sure you probably have something to say, since you have the therapeutic angle in working with medicines. Do you see those kind of experiences? Do you meet those kind of clients where they come in and then all of their trauma responses are amplified rather than becoming conscious and consciously becoming aware of those? Because it's hard to get to that place on our own. So one of the reasons that I highly recommend like a therapist that understands and knows these territories on a psychotherapeutic angle, to point out these little things that could create shifts and then the breakthroughs and then the understanding. So I'm sure you have something to say on that, Sanne.
Yeah, so first of all, it's knowing that really what psychedelics do, they also amplify really what's within us. So like I said, on the one hand, that's why it's very powerful tools for us to reconnect with our truth, but on the other hand, what's also stored in our bodies is also trauma, right? So it can also bring up old traumas, right? So then what actually happens in the experience is not necessarily that people have a mystical experience, but they really become aware of the things they've had suppressed, because what we're doing in a psychedelic experience, we're opening up the door to our unconscious, right? And beforehand, we don't really know what we're going to find when we open up the unconscious. So that's why it's always important to go in well prepared, in the sense of like, I really know what I'm doing, and knowing that older trauma resurfacing, that is a possibility. But then in that case, it's happening for you because it's already impacting someone's life. But then it happens more on an unconscious level. So what I sometimes see is that because we're not really well educated around what is trauma and what is childhood trauma, that most people, especially people a little bit older of age, because my generation is already a little bit more opened up to it, I find from my experience, that we can assume that we have had a really good childhood. And then maybe on the outside, it looks like that we had a really good childhood, but actually there was still a lot of pain or a lot of loneliness there, or a lot of things that were abused that we didn't really think as abuse at all. So I think in those cases, it's more common for that to really shock someone, for example. So that's why it's always very then recommended to work with a therapist who has an understanding of trauma. And to touch more upon the other thing that you mentioned, is what's more about, I think, the spiritual and the dissociation. So I think the first thing is that the problem is, and I see it especially in Western culture, we have a really kind of like, and this is something that I really discovered lately, a really kind of misunderstanding of what spirituality is. Right. So what I think has kind of happened, and that's kind of connected to kind of like the first wave and now the second wave. So what we already saw in the first wave is kind of like more, I think, the wave of Buddhism and yoga and also psychedelics. And now you see maybe more what different indigenous, like a wave of indigenous culture, especially like more the cultures in Central America and South America are now really kind of coming to us, and it's beautiful, but it's not really integrated. So the same thing you saw kind of in the first wave is that okay, we're now having kind of these new practices or these new things that are very interesting and fascinating, or understandings that transcendence and all these different things, but because it's almost again brought in like the Western commercialized way, we don't really have an understanding of what it actually is. And what I mean by that is that the knowledge is not really embodied. So we just have all this information and things, or all these products or all these people that come and share about these experiences, but it's not really embodied. And so I think we see that kind of mirrored back to us in the psychedelic experience. So that's also kind of more linked to dissociation. So what that means is that we can go out of body and have an experience where of a dissolution of the ego. So we're kind of immediately one with everything, or we meet different guides, or there are so many different experiences that we can have in an out-of-body experience. And what is then very important is afterwards the grounding process. And this is also something that I experienced very strongly before even I tried psychedelics with my near-death experience. Like, I had no clue about that. Like, I suddenly had this understanding of what you say of the universe, and all these different truths were downloading all the time. But what was very important, and that's a huge process, was then I had to kind of really ground. So even if we think about concepts of the 5D, for example, when we look at different dimensions, it's not literally like we're going to another place, or things suddenly are going to look different. If you, for example, look at 5 dimension, it's actually just living from the heart. So living in the heart frequency. So it's not about, okay, suddenly we're no longer going to have problems there. It's like an absence of conflict because we're living in this reality. So I think one thing is very important is to focus a lot more on grounding. And also when we talk about psychedelics, like, okay, integration, but really integration, align kind of, and grounding, really bringing those two together. And because, for example, when we have a very deep spiritual experience, and what can happen, because it can be very powerful, beautiful experience, that we want to go back. Right. So then instead of really integrating and processing and really coming back to kind of the mindfulness saying of chop wood and carry water, and really focusing on our daily life, or kind of really coming back to kind of the things that ground us in life,
is
then
that,
we can really...
Is that what you mean by grounding? Because, you know, grounding can be in itself like a very unreachable, complex concept for many people. Like, what does that mean? What does grounding mean? Do you know what I mean? This is like another one.
No, I can understand. So I think the easiest way to say it is grounding, I would see as growing your roots, to kind of symbolize. And what I mean by that is, so what happens also, and this is also linked to dissociation. So why people dissociate is because they don't feel safe in this earth. So grounding, what is very important part of our grounding is that we really feel safe in this earth, in this reality, in this world where we're living. Because if we don't feel safe here, where are we going to go? We're going to go to maybe another place where it's in our imagination, or it's another psychedelic experience, or a substance use. What we're just finding a place. And a place and a state is very aligned for us as human beings, because our mind can travel. So then we're kind of going and seeking that. But
which is the escapism, right? I mean, yeah. if it's done unconsciously, if it's not brought to the conscious awareness, one can continually, you know, a lot of people, don't get me wrong, a lot of people that experience big experiences of psychedelic medicine, they say, who would want to come back and do this again? Like, who does that? Who would want to sit in an ayahuasca ceremony every weekend? Who does that? People do that. And that's because psychedelic medicines responds to the container and the intentional work and the level of conscious awareness. I think one of my observations that these medicines they respond to the container being the person, where they are at their evolutionary journey and where they are in their conscious awareness, self-awareness. So yes, people do this is real. This is happening. People do go and sit every weekend on a ceremony of ayahuasca, or even multiple different medicines of ayahuasca, San Pedro, and then mushrooms, and then in between try a bufo, maybe squeeze a cambo as well. This is real. Like, this is happening. And what this tells us, like you said, if you haven't understood your intention, why you're working with this medicine in the first place, what is the goal? Is it because you can't be in your body? You can't be here. You can't be in your reality. Therefore, you're seeking another reality to fit in, right? Like you said, like, these experiences can be another opening for people to escape this uncomfortable state that they don't like. I meet so many people, Sanne, they just say, I'm not from this planet. I think I'm a well, you know, there's these concepts. Do you know what I mean?
Starseed. Yeah.
Starseed and all of, like, do you know what I mean?
And I know what you mean. And actually, I like integrating the spiritual perspective with the earthly perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really believe is that the number one problem is that a lot of people, especially sensitive and empathic people who would kind of resonate more with, like you said, being a starseed, or not being from this planet, or a lot of different things, is what it's really acknowledging that most people, and I really know from being very highly sensitive, is like, most highly sensitive people don't feel safe on this earth, because we live in a society where there's a lot of trauma, right? So I think, and that's what is very important also in the spaces where we do psychedelics in the first place, that there are very safe spaces, because that already prevents things like that from happening. So I think it's so important that we start to focus on really feeling safe in this earth and in this reality. And there are some people that are very they access different truth, or that they're very aligned with different spiritual teachings and things like that. And I don't think actually there's anything wrong with that in itself. I think the problem is that a lot of people just don't feel safe in their body. And when you dissociate, you don't feel safe in your body. It's actually that simple. So I think that's where somatic healing can be very helpful, and more embodiment practices where we really work with the body. So how can we really feel safe in a body, in the here and now? And no matter what your story is of your life, of how you got here and things like that, it's about acknowledging and agreeing that we are all here to be present, and really being honest with yourself on where you're at, you know? So it means that some of us, when you don't feel safe, and I had this too, is that you have the tendency to escape. So instead, I think of just judging people that are escaping, it's also seeing like, okay, where is this really coming from? And another point that you touch upon, and I experience it too, is that there can also be, and I think especially this is more of my generation, is that we want to belong. And we have this really deep sense of wanting to belong. And that a lot of us, we grow up in spaces that are very superficial. And we kind of break free from that. And then we're looking for new spaces. And a lot of these people, they end up in more spiritual communities or psychedelic circles. And they finally have a feeling of belonging. Okay, I can actually be vulnerable here and be authentic here. And that only becomes problematic when then a psychedelic space is actually the only space where you start to feel safe. So again, coming back to that safety. So I think, I do want to mention one thing, like sometimes people are on a medicine path where they, they really start to work deeply with the medicine, and then they can have a lot of experiences in a short time. But then it's very intentional, right? It's very part of the path. And I've also seen people do that, then it's very in alignment. But I've also seen it done where it's very out of alignment, and you notice it. You notice it immediately about how grounded someone is and how someone speaks about the medicine.
You can say that again. Like, seriously, Sanne, this is such a great point to make. So let's just clarify this, because this is so important for us to mention again and again. When somebody is doing their medicine work, let's call it medicine work, because I do believe whatever they are, the psychedelic substance or plant medicines or psychedelic medicines, all of them to me are powerful medicines that can alter our lives in an instant, you know, not all the time, but most cases it does. And, you know someone who's doing their work authentically. You always meet these people who are in the psychedelic space, and you always can feel and spot the one that is always in their authenticity, and they are doing this work really intentionally. It's something about their energy, it's something about their calmness, it's something about their being. They are hyper present with you. They just, they just stand out. And then you have like generalizing again, a lot of us, a lot of the people who come into the space, they just want to get to that image of, we all carry this mental image of where should we be, like in terms of healing, in terms of success, in terms of achievement. And we somehow chase that mental image desperately, engaging in all kinds of medicine, all kinds of modalities, not just psychedelic medicines, but this as well. There are so many circles that are happening now, like New Age spirituality is on the rise. And you always can spot as well when somebody is abusing these medicines and they're not really tapping into the authentic work. So it's so revealing, because there is somehow all of us carry something in us that we can sense when someone is out of alignment, like you said. But would you say that sometimes, you said you've seen people doing this in and out of alignment, and do you think sometimes the need to belong overrides our cautiousness? So deep down, like we can end up in circles, medicine circles that are out of alignment, facilitated in unsafe ways, but people still kind of go there because belonging means more than what the anticipated harm can come from these places. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I think I do know what you mean. So yeah, I think first thing, I think it's very sad that in our world we have so little safe spaces for people to go. I think that's the number one problem. So it's not even the problem of the individual, but I think it's a huge societal problem, and that's just one expression of that. So I think what is important is also to create safe spaces that have nothing to do with psychedelics or these things. And another problem is really spaces that are not safe, right? So when we're doing it in spaces that are not safe, and I think most people, when they hold these ceremonies, are unconscious of it. It's not like ill intent. But what can happen is there can also be like certain attachments can be created that are unhealthy. So it can also sometimes be that if a facilitator there is too much in maybe even a saving complex, that they also create unhealthy attachment, like doing the healing for the individual, and not really allowing someone to step into kind of their own authority and their own sovereignty. So they really remember, okay, this is not like the own, because again, I think this is what we mentioned earlier, right? When something externally becomes the source of your healing. So I think it's an expression of that too. And so there's a lot to it, right? So a lot of things, when we look at escapism, it's a huge thing, because I think a lot of people are suffering right now. So I do have a lot of understanding and also compassion for it, because I think a lot of these individuals, they really don't have any ill intent. But we're also being fed like a little bit more narcissistic image through social media, where we're now kind of psychedelics is also more trendy. So again, it's a belonging, and it's kind of, you see it more of younger people though. Is it kind of, oh yeah, and I also have had it almost becomes again a thing, right? It used to be kind of the looks and the material items. It can now kind of shapeshift into what seems more spiritual. But then it can still be not authentic, and it can be someone else who's like really spiritual and devoted, but it's 100% authentic with them. So I think it's a lot less focusing on what is someone actually doing on the outside, but again, focusing on what is really happening within someone. And when you're, a bit more sensitive, you can just feel that with someone. So, but I would always meet it kind of with compassion and kind of always helping people to see things in a gentle way. Because like most people, they don't really have ill intent. It's like it's a very unconscious process, and we all have some forms of escapism or whatever it is. But it is something that's really operating strongly in the psychedelic field. So I think it's important to be aware of that too. And also to say, like, it's also okay to let go of psychedelics, because that's not something that's talked about very often. I had it in, I think it was November last year, so it was probably more than 3 months ago. I had an incredibly beautiful, powerful experience with psilocybin, and in a beautiful ceremony, incredibly well held. And the intuition that I received then, it was like, this is going to be my last experience with psilocybin. And I noticed afterwards there was this like almost like this sadness there of like, but I love going in ceremony. And I don't think I was overdoing it. I was always keeping space in between. But even I had this moment where I was like, but I love going to these spaces and the ceremonies. And of course, I'm still part of ceremony facilitating, but it was very clear, like, I don't have to take more psilocybin. And I don't know if that's going to continue for like the rest of my life. I don't know. It's just very in this experience, but it felt really like in that moment, this is going to be my last experience like this, at least with psilocybin. And I had this moment where I was like, even with me, it was kind of, it becomes part of your identity. So I think this is again what psychedelics actually teach us, to let go. Also allowing us to go through these identity deaths and not holding too tight to anything. So it can be that we have a certain spiritual path, or a certain maybe even academic path, or a certain profession, and at some point we're asked to let go of that, and to then actually to really be in harmony with life and our authentic truth is to allow ourselves to let go of that. And I think actually it strengthened afterward the way that I am able to facilitate, because now I kind of have to embody even more that it's not just the medicine taking it, because that was what the experience was all about. I experienced more than I could ever imagine possible with psilocybin. And it was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing. And I'm still integrating it. That's how long an integration process can be. Sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes even longer to really integrate something. And I really had to be like, and what really came to mind was this kind of saying, and I think it comes from Alan Watts. It's kind of when, when you pick up the phone and you received a message, it's time to hang up the call. And I received a message of the medicine, everything that I could possibly kind of download from that experience. And then it was about, okay, maybe I don't need another psychedelic experience.
I really love that you're talking to this. Gosh, I want to say so many things here, but I'm trying to be really mindful. If we look at the indigenous use of medicines, right? There's a reason why the elders, there's a concept of elders, there's a concept of, like a generation coming into medicine, and it's like it's like the way we go on right now in this, Western model. It's almost like that consumerism is so triggered. It's almost like the medicines are going to just finish. We're not going to take enough, or we're not going to have enough. Or it's like there is this urgency, or there is this constant need to take more and more and more, like we do with everything, right? But if we look at how the indigenous people have incorporated medicine into their lives, it's like they bring the medicine into their lives, but not just in one decade of their lives. It's like it's over the period of their life, entire life. The Mazatec tribes, for example, initiation of the 5-year-olds. When I heard that, I was like, wow, this is interesting. Imagine talking about this in the Western model, talking to any parent in the West. Imagine, your child undergoing an initiation with mushrooms at the age of 5, right? It's like in the Western model, we have reduced this thing to this one particular stage of our lives. And in that time period, like we just consume. And yet, if we look at the other ways of working with the medicines, like I spoke to a really lovely guest, and he said, before the medicine elder allows the person to commune, again, another key word, like commune, we don't just take and eat. There is a commune, for me, is like there is a relationship, there's a harmony, there's a preparation, like there's a whole foundational aspects to this before you get to that point of ingesting the medicine. So he had to do all kinds of other things. He had to fast, do other mindfulness practices. He had to do a lot of cultivating relationship with the nature. He had to do all kinds of detoxing, cleansing in a container where there was a watchful eye of the elder who understands the process. And then when he was ready, then he was able to take the medicine. And this might be spread out the entire life of that person. They might commune with the medicine in their younger days, and then adolescence, and then as they become a young adult. And then, even I remember from my native friend who's a facilitator of ayahuasca, for example, she's an ayahuasca baby. She always says, I'm an ayahuasca baby. And I'm like, what does that mean? She said, when my parents couldn't conceive, my mother sat with an ayahuasca. So can you see how they use medicines in respect to their challenges, like as an ally? You're suffering from a ailment or condition or something. It's time to sit with the medicine. There is something going on. It's time to sit with the medicine. And it's not like how we do it. Like we just keep taking. There is this, again, this is the consumerism part of the Western model. Completely like also justifying under the healing, or the most dangerous one I know is happening now is the entrepreneurs who just wants to crack the code to become more successful and be more financially free through the help of psychedelics, which is insane. I heard so many retreats and different things are happening around the world, facilitating this kind of intention. You and I, we both know that psychedelic medicines do not agree with those kind of things, and they don't care, and they don't care about how much money you want to make. This is my observation anyway, and this is like the space that I'm coming from, and they never agree, and they don't care, and they don't entertain those kind of intentions of becoming more successful, cultivating more money, more material stuff. They don't care about things like that. And so these are the challenges. So I think you understand what I mean by integrating medicine into the life of the person and respecting them as an ally, as a, help that we seek when we need them.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and because that's actually what we need. We actually need elders. And when you look or feel into an elder, it has a very anchoring energy. And I think my generation, and there are exceptions, of course, and I know elders like that, but it's so rare. So why are these young people escaping all over the place? It's because we don't have that energy here, maybe in Europe or like in different places where we live, that really anchoring energy, like, when something is off, in our world, it's a place where we can go to. So I think it's very important is creating more safe spaces and not limiting yourself to a subculture, because that can happen with psychedelics. It may become a subculture, and I've had moments where I kind of felt like, okay, this is really the subculture, but I always felt like something was a little bit off, So, and then it's again going back to belonging is really, you find belonging naturally when you're really authentic. And sometimes it can also be moments where you stand alone. And there are really great lessons in there too. But yeah, like it can be, I think it would be beautiful to see if we would even zoom out more. How would it, that's what I like doing. Like, what would it be like in like 30 years or 50 years when we think of this psychedelic movements, instead of being in this very consumer culture of kind of the next few months, next year. And I can notice all these thinking patterns in myself too, because we're kind of part of that culture. So it influences us too. But I think it's very important to really catch ourselves when we go back into the rush, into the more, and to say, no, this is enough. And it all comes back to the core belief of, or I am enough the way I am. And, like even, when people more in indigenous cultures and practices, even though people can, go to medicines or to these medicine circles for like certain like healing or things like that. But actually the healing, instead of like the fixing, okay, there's something wrong with me, I need to go find something to fix me. That's something very, I think, in our culture.
Yes.
That very internalized, that really taking it very personal. And that's incredibly different, because otherwise it's just, okay, healing is just, okay, I'm going to, again, reconnect with that wholeness within me and to kind of, hand over my problems and my things, instead of just having to figure it out on my own. And that is very different. Like fixing, often it's almost like this idea of, okay, I have to get rid of something that's wrong with me. And then we're completely forgetting everything that contributed to that pattern or to that thing as we see as an illness in the first place. Yeah, and then we're kind of fighting life and ourselves. We're in constant conflict. Yeah, and there was actually one indigenous elder from the Indian tradition, and he said, like, as long as you're in your head, in your mind, you're always in conflict. Always. And only when you kind of really come back to your heart, then you can really feel and experience that everything is as it is, and as it is supposed to be. And he was that, like, we have one heart and we like two brain hemispheres. So it's as long as and I think that's the problem, is that we can be in our heads a lot, trying to figure things out on a mental level, and or kind of then become like a dog chasing its own tail, not getting anywhere. Because those answers are not found by the mind, and we just sometimes need to turn off the switch. And that's actually what is really powerful. Because sometimes I even say, like, the brain is just like a computer. We just have to turn it off and turn it back on again, and a lot of the problems will naturally solve themselves. And psychedelics can help us to turn off that switch, which can be very hard for a lot of people, which is understandable. But it's not going to magically fix everything.
No, and so I guess if we were to do like a show on psychedelics 101, like if we were to strip all of these information that's been shared, and there's like the misconceptions, the miseducation, misleading information on what they are. I think if we were to, I know, just like general speaking again, I know it's not that simple, but let's say if we try to strip it down to the bare minimum of what we're dealing with here, what can we do in order to maybe receive more lasting benefits. I'm hearing from what you're saying as well, the recognition of the lack of belonging in our society is huge. Step one, like really acknowledging this fact. It is a fact. That's probably why, I mean, you probably know about the book, Hold On to Your Kids, right? It wasn't written for no reason. And in that book, a lot has been said that if a child don't feel or perceive like they belong to the family, they'll go and find another place, another family, friends that different places, like you said, to belong to. So the fact that, we all seek that belonging in the Western world is so important. And then creating safe spaces and conditions, like deliberate conditions that can allow people to crack open from these conditions and come out from these, deeply ingrained, ways of thinking, like templates, for example. And then maybe have a lot of people, like all the generational elders, if there is any, or influencers that have done enough authentic work to know how to anchor the generation that's coming into this space of healing or transformation or the spiritual work, because it's not necessarily healing, because healing is also, I always believe that the intentional healing process also brings about the organic spiritual growth. It's kind of like the byproduct. Like we don't need to seek spiritual, because you can. If you seek the spiritual path, it was a healing path, and then you seek the healing path, then you become spiritual. It's like, it's all hand in hand. It kind of goes hand in hand. And I think once we kind of clarify these kind of conditions, and then the medicine, the last. This is what I'm hearing. And I think this would be, for now, for me, it satisfies my, the way I feel about what's going on out there, and how we can, start to bring about more coherent integrations, experiences, and understanding. Like, for example, when you said the last experience of your psilocybin experience was, for example, there was an innate knowing that might be the last time, right? That should be okay either way. There is nothing wrong with feeling that way, and there's nothing wrong with never taking them again, because we can even translate it as, okay, maybe for now, maybe 20 years down the line, Sanne in a different stage of her life, things might change, but that's okay too, right? It's more about coming out of that consumerism mindset, stepping away, taking a step back, and just spending more time integrating and understanding, and be curious actually about ourselves, rather than what next experience will give me, but what can I do for myself now that I've had this experience, right? Sometimes forcing it doesn't help. Sometimes people force. What is it? What is my block? What is it that I can't see? Why am I in this, state? Like, I feel stuck. I feel frustrated. I feel overwhelmed, and I'm suffering, and there's lots of challenges. and I'm sad. Like, these are the common, responses. And I must find out why. So I will keep taking medicine till I know why. Yeah. Like, these are the dangers that I see again and again.
Yeah, and it's also knowing that's all part of the human experience, right? So there we will always, and of course it's not about staying there and dwelling in it for too long, but we'll all have moments where we're stuck or where we experience doubt or all these different things. And I think what becomes problematic is when we start to identify too much with it. Because then we kind of create a story around the feeling or the experience that is actually very temporary. And, so I've also seen that it's actually, I think, if people are already aware of, like different therapeutic understandings and, maybe even with shadow work and psychedelic work, is that we didn't constantly focus on what is the next thing that we need to fix ourselves. And it's kind of, almost like that, like you said, the consumer mentality and bringing that more into the therapeutic space. So I think it's only someone themselves can know if something is in alignment or if it's not. If like another psychedelic experience is really what they need or not. But I think what is very important is that we create a practice, like a daily practice, where we learn to be really honest with ourselves. And for me, that has been really writing. And it's very interesting now that I'm writing my first book, which is probably going to be published more towards probably fall this year. Still a lot more work to be done. But what is so interesting is when I'm reading back all my journals over the years. And there were so many moments where I was in doubt, so many moments where I was stuck or in fear. But what I can now see from like looking back at it over a period of like 7 years is like, I see, okay, these are actually moments. And while it's happening, you think like, I'm stuck and it's just going to be like this. And, but what you notice is that, a lot of things, they naturally resolve themselves. And that, again, getting back to what I said before, it's like when we stay in our minds, like in our head, we'll always be in conflict. So sometimes what we need is not another psychedelic experience. We just need to learn to get back into our bodies and into our hearts, reconnect with nature, with people we feel safe with. And and maybe also another psychedelic experience when the time is right. But I think it's most honest to learn to be really honest with ourselves. Like, when is it healthy or when is it kind of becoming unhealthy, and not bringing more judgment to it. But seeing like, okay, why am I not fully feeling safe? Or why do I think that only a psychedelic can help me with this? And then questioning, is this really true? So it's also learning to question the beliefs that we hold.
That's wonderful. Such a beautiful way of eloquently putting it all together. Thank you, Sanne. This has been really, really beautiful. I feel like this was our catch-up call somehow. We have listeners to our catch-up call. Hope to, have you back again and again, because I just see you're growing every time we speak. There's more. There is a organic and consistent evolution happening here. Your insights are kind of beyond your years, which I really appreciate. And before I let you go, what would you like to say if a young person just discovered the psychedelic medicines and also this path, let's say, coming from your own experience, like what would you say to them, the young people in this space now?
To the young people.
To everyone, but
to everyone.
but mostly young. Yeah.
Yeah. What I really learned, and this is something I really learned through the creative process, is that we make ourselves really responsible for a lot of things that are not our responsibility. And especially the younger generation, we do this a lot because of the state the world is in, right? Like the earth and everything. And what I learned is the most important thing is to listen, to show up, and allow. So when we walk that path and we do it every day, we just listen, we show up for what is important to us, and we actually allow. And then for me, in the creative process, was just allowing the creative intelligence to move through me, or to allow like the wisdom of nature, or whatever that process looks like. But I think it's really important to say, like, life is a co-creation, and it's not all your responsibility. Or when something negative happens, it doesn't mean you have done something wrong, because we now see a lot of teachings that it's like you create your own reality. And of course, there's truth in, that our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions, of course, influence the reality that we live in. It's remembering life is a co-creation, and kind of your part of the contract is just to listen, to show up and allow, and create a lot of space for listening. And that's far more important than knowing it all. It's actually the ability to listen. Yeah.
That's so powerful. Thank you so much. Reminds me of that story. I think, I can't remember, was it Dr. Mate spoke to this? He said, do you know, in the Western model, there is this individualism is really kind of pushed, and kind of there's a lot of drivers around why, this whole self-empowerment, which is great, like this individualistic approach to living, that's fine as well. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think somehow it's been ingrained in us that we must prove ourselves to the world, like we must take everything on our shoulder, and we need to achieve all these big crazy things and leave a legacy, like all these conditionings. And he was talking to they did a study around these communities, people who actually live in communities that embrace the community life. They interview them individually, and they asked them questions that they had to answer, like they had to think about themselves as this individual person, and the answers had to come from their own individual, insights and how they perceive themselves. And they didn't go far with that kind of research. That they didn't get too far, because they just didn't collaborate. They didn't just collaborate, but they also thought this was embarrassing. Let alone collaborating in this study, they just thought this was embarrassing. Like for them to make it all about them, and it's their own individual, life, and even to make it all about them. I think somewhere along those lines, it was really embarrassing beyond comprehension, because for them it was more about the collective, more about the community and community's needs, and how they show up to play their part in the community, not just selfishly about what they want individually and what they need. So I always think of that story, and I always, come back to our Western model of this perpetuation on the individualism that sometimes doesn't go down too well. And what you spoke to is kind of reminded me of that. Yes, it's the ultimately it's the co-creation. We are in this together as a collective, which sometimes doesn't feel like. A lot of people are really lonely and alone sometimes, but that's what it is. We are here together. And I like that you said, don't take it all on your shoulders. It's not always your fault, or it's not your responsibility.
Yeah. And that makes life a lot lighter, right? And there's also a great gift, in individualism, that we have, but it's also, recognizing when we swing too far on the side of individualism, and kind of coming back to interdependence, right? So I can really be the unique individual that I am, and also to be part of a community. And I think we want and need both. To really live a fulfilling life.
Yeah. Amazing. Beautiful. Sanne, lastly, what are your projects? What are you working on apart from your book? What are the things that you'd like to share? We'll add your links and how our listeners can connect with you in the show notes, but is there anything that you want to shout out?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm really focused on writing my book and creating art and working more privately with clients, psilocybin sessions. And so that's what I'm really focused on now. If people are curious, you can also just go to my website. I also regularly create like guided meditations and share a lot of my writing and different things. So just find me on my website, sannehart.com, or just on Instagram, or I also have a YouTube channel. You can just find me under Sanne Hart. And if you really want to stay up to date to anything that I'm doing, you can just also sign up for my newsletter. And once in a while, I also do different live events and things like that. And I also have some spaces once in a while opening up to work one-on-one. But of course, the spaces are limited too. So if you just want to follow the journey and the process, you can just find me in those places. And
Amazing. Thank you so much. And really appreciate your insights as always. And all the best. I'm sure we'll have you back soon. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. As always, you can comment, share, and reach out. Don't be shy. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now. Thanks, Sanne.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.